What most people misunderstand about an empath's disappearance is that they imagine it as an impulsive emotional reaction, a sudden decision made in a moment of frustration. But that interpretation couldn't be further from reality. What looks sudden on the outside is, in truth, the final stage of a very long internal process. Because empaths don't break when the problem begins, they break when they've already endured far more than they were ever designed to carry. An empath's threshold for emotional discomfort is unusually high, not because they are stronger in the conventional sense, but because they are wired to understand, to rationalize, and to absorb. When tension appears in a relationship, they don't immediately resist it, they lean into it. They ask questions, they analyze, they attempt to decode behavior rather than reject it. Where most people would draw a boundary, the empath extends empathy, and that extension, repeated over time, becomes a pattern. This is where the real danger begins, not in the external situation, but in the internal justification. Because the empath can always find a reason to stay. They tell themselves the other person is struggling, misunderstood, wounded, stressed. And in many cases, those assessments are accurate. But accuracy doesn't make the dynamic healthy. It simply makes it easier to tolerate. So instead of reacting early, the empath adapts. They minimize their own needs. They downplay discomfort. They silence instincts that would otherwise signal, this is too much. And every time they do this, they move the line a little further. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes normal. What once would have triggered distance now gets explained away. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional debt. Every unspoken frustration, every dismissed feeling, every moment of overextension, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates, quietly, invisibly. And because the empath isn't expressing it outwardly, the people around them often assume everything is fine. There's no conflict, no confrontation, no clear warning sign, just continued presence. But internally, something very different is happening. The empath is keeping track, not consciously, not like a checklist, but psychologically. The mind and body register imbalance even when the person chooses not to act on it. There's a growing sense of exhaustion that doesn't quite make sense at first. A subtle detachment that starts to creep in. Conversations that once felt meaningful begin to feel draining. Effort starts to outweigh reward. And still, they stay. This is the part that confuses people the most. Why would someone continue investing when they're already feeling depleted? The answer is rooted in identity. For many empaths, being the one who understands, who stays, who supports, that's not just behavior, it's who they believe they are. Walking away doesn't just feel like losing a relationship, it feels like betraying their own nature. So they push further, they give more chances, they adjust their expectations. They convince themselves that if they just approach it differently, communicate better, be more patient, show more compassion, something will shift. And occasionally, there are small improvements, just enough to reinforce the belief that staying is the right choice. But those improvements are rarely sustainable, because the underlying dynamic hasn't changed. The empath is still overextending, and the imbalance remains. Eventually, the system reaches its limit. And this is what the breaking point really is. It's not a reaction to one final event. It's the moment when the empath can no longer reconcile the gap between what they're giving and what they're receiving. It's when the internal cost becomes undeniable. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. There's a quiet realization that happens here. Something along the lines of, I can't keep doing this. Not because they don't care, but because caring has come at too high a price. What's important to understand is that this realization doesn't come with anger. It comes with clarity. The empath isn't suddenly overwhelmed, they've been overwhelmed for a long time. The difference now is that they stop denying it. And once that happens, everything changes. The energy they once used to maintain the relationship begins to withdraw. Not intentionally, not as a tactic, but naturally. The same way the body pulls back from something that causes pain. Conversations become shorter. Emotional investment decreases. The instinct to fix, to help, to engage starts to fade. To the outside world, this shift is almost imperceptible at first. But internally, it's decisive. Because when an empath reaches this point, they're no longer negotiating with the situation. They're no longer trying to make it work at any cost. They're observing it clearly, without distortion. And clarity for an empath is often the beginning of the end. The breaking point, then, isn't where they fall apart. It's where they finally stop abandoning themselves. And once someone reaches that level of internal honesty, There's only one direction left to go. Because the moment an empath fully recognizes the weight they've been carrying is the moment they begin to put it down and they rarely pick it up again. If the first phase is about endurance, this next phase is about awareness, and awareness is far more disruptive than pain, because pain can be explained away. Pain can be rationalized, minimized, or even normalized. But once awareness sets in, the entire structure holding that dynamic together begins to collapse. For an empath, this awakening doesn't arrive all at once. It's not a dramatic epiphany or a sudden emotional explosion. It's quieter than that. More precise. It often begins with a subtle contradiction, something that doesn't quite add up. A pattern that repeats a few too many times. A moment where words and actions no longer align in a way that can be easily justified. At first, they try to resolve it the same way they always have, through understanding. They look deeper. They give the benefit of the doubt. They consider context, history, stress, past wounds, and again, their interpretations are often accurate. But this time, something is different. The explanations no longer bring relief. They only bring clarity. And clarity in this context is uncomfortable, because what the empath starts to see is not just the other person's behavior, but their own role in sustaining it. Not as a cause, but as a constant. They begin to recognize that their patience has been interpreted as permission. Their forgiveness has been mistaken for tolerance. Their consistency has allowed inconsistency to continue unchecked. This is a difficult realization to sit with, not because it produces guilt, but because it challenges identity. The empath has always seen themselves as someone who helps, who heals, who understands, but now they're faced with the possibility that these same traits, when applied without boundaries, have made them vulnerable to being undervalued. And that realization reframes everything. Moments that once felt confusing start to make sense. The imbalance becomes visible. The one-sided effort, the emotional labor, the lack of reciprocity, it's no longer abstract. It's concrete, measurable, and most importantly, undeniable. What's happening here is a cognitive shift. The empath is moving from emotional reasoning to structural analysis. Instead of asking, why are they acting this way, they begin asking, what is this pattern costing me? That shift in questioning is critical because it redirects focus from the other person's internal world to their own lived experience. And once that shift occurs, the empath begins to reclaim something they've been gradually losing perspective. They start to see that intention and impact are not the same. That someone can have reasons for their behavior, but those reasons don't erase the effect it has. They begin to understand that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice. That compassion without boundaries isn't virtue, it's exposure. This is where illusions break down. The belief that love means enduring anything begins to dissolve. The idea that staying is always the stronger choice starts to weaken. And perhaps most importantly, the assumption that their role is to fix or carry others no longer feels accurate, it feels misplaced. Now, this doesn't turn the empath cold. It doesn't strip away their ability to care. What it does is refine it. It introduces discernment. They begin to differentiate between someone who is struggling and someone who is comfortable with them struggling. And that distinction changes how they engage entirely. Because once an empath sees that their energy is being consumed without being valued, they begin to realize that they are not being seen or heard. Continuing to give it starts to feel less like kindness and more like neglect, self-neglect. At this stage, you'll often notice a quiet recalibration. The empath becomes more observant, less reactive. They stop over-explaining. They stop trying to be understood by people who have shown no real effort to understand them. There's a subtle withdrawal of unnecessary effort, not as punishment, but as alignment. And this is where many relationships begin to destabilize. Because the dynamic was built on imbalance. It relied on the empath compensating, adjusting, absorbing. When that behavior changes, even slightly, it disrupts the entire system. The other person may feel the difference, even if they can't articulate it. They may push back, question the change, or attempt to reestablish the old pattern. But the empath is no longer operating from the same framework. They're no longer trying to preserve the connection at any cost. They're evaluating it quietly, objectively. And once evaluation replaces attachment, the outcome becomes much more predictable. Because the truth is, once you clearly see your value being mishandled, it becomes very difficult to continue offering it in the same way. Not out of pride, but out of awareness. You can't unknow what you now understand. This phase is often misunderstood as distance or detachment, but that's not entirely accurate. It's actually precision. The empath is becoming selective not with their empathy itself, but with where they place it. They're no longer distributing it indiscriminately. They're directing it with intention, and that shift marks the beginning of emotional independence. They're no longer defined by how much they can endure for others. They're beginning to define themselves by how well they can protect what matters within themselves. Their energy, their time, their emotional bandwidth that's no longer an open resource. It's something to be managed, respected, and, when necessary, withheld. What follows from here is not immediate departure, but it is irreversible movement. The empath may still be present physically. They may still engage on the surface, but internally, the attachment has changed form. It's no longer rooted in obligation or hope, it's grounded in awareness. And awareness doesn't negotiate with illusion. Once you truly understand where you stand in someone's life, not based on what they say, but on what they consistently do, you're faced with a choice. Continue investing in a pattern that diminishes you, or step back and realign with your own value. And for the empath who has reached this level of clarity, that choice becomes increasingly simple. Because the moment you recognize that your kindness has been treated as something ordinary is the moment you realize it was never meant to be given to just anyone. By the time we reach this phase, something important has already happened beneath the surface. The empath is no longer trying to figure things out, they've already figured it out. The confusion that once kept them engaged has been replaced with clarity, and that clarity begins to change how they show up in ways that are subtle but decisive. What most people miss is that disconnection doesn't start with distance, it starts with silence. Not the absence of words, but the absence of emotional investment behind those words. The empath may still be present in the room, still responding, still participating on a surface level, but internally, something has shifted. The emotional current that once fueled the connection is no longer flowing in the same way. This isn't a defensive reaction. It's not an attempt to punish or manipulate. It's a natural consequence of awareness. When you clearly see that your energy is not being met, not being valued, or not being reciprocated,